Hello and welcome to Nosotros, the podcast about cultura, política y más. I'm your host, Elaine Ayala, Metro columnist of the San Antonio Express News. My guest today is Christopher Carmona. He's visiting professor of Mexican American Studies and English at Our Lady of the Lake University, who's here to talk about a powerful team of Chicano academics who are refusing to forget. Welcome, Christopher.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get to refusing to forget, tell us a little about your own work as a poet, a researcher, and an academic.
Well, I've been, as a writer, I've been working on, lots of different things. So mostly, I've been writing poetry and fiction for a long time now. And mostly it covers the experience of, growing up Mexican American Chicano in South Texas. But, so a lot of the work that I've done, especially over the last 12, 13 years, has really focused on the history, especially around in South Texas.
And your book, you've written a book that is sort of one of the works that came out of the Refusing to Forget project. Tell us about that one. So, I have a series of young adult novels that's called El Rinche, which is I guess the term that was used to refer to the Texas Ranger. Can we say it's a Spanglish term or is it a Spanish term?
That's a good question.
I think it's a Spanglish term.
Well, it's mostly, I think it would be Spanglish in a lot of ways because it comes from, looking at the way that they slur the Rinche with Ranger, right? So it's a mixture of the thing.
Rinche, which is spelled R-I-N-C-H-E.
Correct. And so, with that whole history and everything, the book focuses on that. It is a fictionalized account of kind of a superhero novel, Chicano superhero novel, telling the history of this time frame, which is referred to as La Matanza, which happened from roughly about 1910 to about 1920. And so this is, those are the works that that kind of came out of dealing with the research here with looking into the Texas Rangers and the anti-Mexican violence that happened.
So there were several major instances of Texas Ranger violence against Tejano communities in the early part of the 20th century. Latter part of the 19th, early part of the 20th, correct?
That is correct. There's kind of had a history since the Texas Rangers were created in 1823. Of one of their major charges was to kind of clear the lands for the colonizers.
And when you say clear the lands, what do you really mean?
They clear the lands for the colonists that are coming in. But yeah, their charge was to basically remove the Indians from the lands, and really it became kind of also against the Mexicans. A lot of the Mexicans at that time, especially around that time when it was Mexico.
There were several major instances of Texas Ranger violence against Tejano communities. Some of those have been told in history books, others in documentaries that I've seen more recently. But tell us how they first became part of this Texas oral tradition. No, this was not the question.
About the history, yeah.
Okay, I have to go back. Sorry.
No, I shouldn't have moved.
Okay, don't do that unless, because I lose my place so easily. I have the memory of a hummingbird.
Okay.
The Texas Rangers, I think this was the question we were on. The Texas Rangers became a focal point of the Refusing to Forget research project. Tell us how that group organized and why.
Okay, so Refusing to Forget organized primarily around a history that most people don't really know. So it kind of came out of a conference that happened, I believe it was 2013, where the original kind of a group, which was, Monica Munoz Martinez, Sonia Hernandez, Trinidad Gonzalez, Benjamin Johnson, and John Moran Gonzalez, had a panel where they were discussing this history and its impact. And after that panel, they kind of, had a meeting and realized that this needed to be something bigger. And so the focal point is really looking at this anti-Mexican violence, at the turn of the 20th century. And so the reason that the Texas Rangers are the primary focus at the beginning, because they were the instrument that was used to terrorize the families, the Mexican Americans on the border, out of their lands. And they were used in a lot of ways, as really the enforcement arm of a lot of the Anglo ranchers and really the American corporations that were coming in to basically take the lands from the Mexicans during this time period. So they were in themselves the focal point, because a lot of the stories I grew up with, and where the Texas Rangers were the actors in this whole thing.
But they were working in concert with local law enforcement as well as Anglo ranchers who came in to take over lands. And we should also say and talk about how that land became that of others, because this was land that was held legally by those who became citizens of the United States by virtue of the end of the Mexican American War, and they had land grants and were holding on to very rich and lots of acres of land in what is now South Texas and the borderlands.
So yes, I mean, the land grants, most people, I guess, don't know the history of the land grant system, stretches back around the Texas area, because to about the 1700s, but they actually go back to the 1500s. The ones that we focus on here in Texas actually go out toward what at that time was not Louisiana yet, from Louisiana all the way up to Missouri, all the way out toward Utah and into New Mexico territory. And so when we look at the maps in that area, it actually encompasses of what we can now consider northern Mexico, all the way down to Tampico and those areas as well. So those were all lands that were granted by the King of Spain in the 1700s to certain families, certain prominent families. And so these families ended up controlling these lands for about 300 years, until we get to really looking at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century. A lot of this was being, as you said, was after the U.S.-Mexico War. A lot of the land grants were targeted. And land grant owners, even though the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo gave the Mexicans living on the lands American citizenship, there was a lot of laws and practices that were used to systematically take those lands from the Mexican landowners over from 1846 all the way until the early 20th century. So this was a policy of of U.S. expansionism at the time. And so when we look at is what these families controlled and why South Texas becomes such a focal point, is from looking at from south of Nueces to where the Rio Grande was for a long time considered undesirable lands. And most of those were controlled by ranching families. And these were ranching lands, and these were basically prominent Mexican American ranching families who've held on to these for years. So these are very wealthy families. And so when we get to the end of the 19th century and the railroad starts coming through, and the industry changes for the U.S., going to more of a industrialized agricultural society, they targeted these lands for that kind of an expansion. But the problem was that they were owned by Mexican American families who did not want to sell their property. And so this kind of what started this whole thing. So in 1905, you have the Rio Grande Land and Irrigation Company get a grant from the state of Texas to what we now call terraform these lands from From ranching.
Terraform,
which is changing the landscape from one thing to another. At that time, it was from ranching to agriculture, because the big move was agriculture.
Yes, the Southerners were coming in,
Yes.
so what they knew was agriculture.
And so then these lands became very profitable for cotton and citrus and these different things. But and so this granted them the money to do that, but they wouldn't. The landowners would not sell their property for this to happen.
So they were encouraged to sell those properties.
Well, yeah, what happens is they go back to the governor, and the governor tells them that they can use the Texas Rangers, and whatever they do, they will not be prosecuted. So this was found.
So it was state-sanctioned violence.
Correct.
There were several major instances of Texas Ranger violence against Tejano communities, and some of those have been written about by academics like you. They've been told in a few documentaries, but tell us how they first became part of storytelling among Tejanos, Mexicans, and Mexican Americans themselves.
So the way that we kept the stories going, and it's still true in a lot of different ways, it's been true in a lot of different communities, is for Mexicans, it was the corrido. When these incidents occurred, they couldn't count on the local papers to cover them. So they captured the stories in corrido form. And those corridos would be sung from place to place to place. And the corrido is a ballad, right? A Mexican ballad that tells a story of incidents and peoples. And this is the way that the stories were preserved for most of this time. And also through oral history and through, the way I learned it is through my grandparents. Told me the stories when I was young. And, but the corridos have really kept them. And, it was because of people like Americo Paredes who helped preserve these corridos that we have them. And we're able to start a lot of these incidents were recorded in these corridos.
And Americo Paredes was a Seminole academic. Then he spent most of his time at UT in Austin, correct?
Correct.
And he is responsible for the Battle of Gregorio Cortes, that story and many others, and brought them to light. He is considered a master of these stories.
In a lot of ways, he's kind of the godfather of Chicano studies, because he was doing this in the 1950s, way before these programs existed. And so, but yeah, he was one of the first, he was actually probably the first person to write about the Texas Rangers in a negative light or a truthful light.
Yeah, in a truthful light.
And with his book, with his pistol in his hand. Yes.
This story of violence and oppression has been handed down, but not until an exhibit appropriately called Life and Death on the Border at the Bullock Museum in Austin in 2016. That story was not in the public realm, not really. I recall the 3 giant books that were put on display in a very emotional way. Just a tiny light was placed over them, and they were great big bounded books that represented testimony. Tell us about that.
So the 3 volumes are volumes of the hearings on the activities of the Texas Rangers that was led by J.T. Canales, who was at the time in 1919 the only Mexican American legislature in Texas. And so
he was from the Valley, from Laredo, from Brownsville.
Yes. And so it's interesting is, they used to introduce him as the greaser from Brownsville.
Oh, God.
At the time. But he was he was instrumental in bringing these hearings, and so in 1919 they held these hearings that were looking into the activities of the Texas Rangers, where over 200 people testified.
And was it 200 people from the Valley who had experienced this? Who were they?
Mostly they were from South Texas, but we do have others, especially if you go out toward the Porvenir Massacre out in El Paso, and even different people around the state, East Texas and others. But the primary focus was what was happening in South Texas, because that was where most of the violence occurred, the majority of the violence.
You mentioned Porvenir. Mm-hmm. That was one of the massacres. So
Correct.
Was La Matanza. Mm-hmm. Just talk about both of them a little bit.
So La Matanza is kind of the generalized term for this entire period. That's what the people call it. As you know, as what it is, it's a massacre of peoples that occurred for over 10 years. Porvenir was unique because it was I think it was probably the only massacre that was actually covered by English language newspaper. And which is what opened the investigation. It led to the opening of the investigation of the Texas Rangers, where it was a Porvenir, which doesn't exist anymore. It was a tiny little village outside of El Paso, which consisted of maybe 50 different families at most.
Many related.
Yes.
It almost was a little neighborhood.
Yes. And at the time, it's obviously the time of the Mexican Revolution. And close by was a ranch called the Bright Ranch, which was raided. Nobody actually knows who raided them or what actually occurred there. But because of this raid, the Texas Rangers and U.S. Army looked for the closest Mexican settlements where there might be men and boys. And so they came across Porvenir. They showed up in the middle of the night. They lined up all the men and boys over, I think it was 13, and they shot them all. And so this became a huge news sensation at the time because you did have one of the school teacher for the area, which was a white man, was actually witnessed the aftermath of this and brought this to the attention of the paper and other people, which was what one of the only times it was very rare moments when it was actually covered, one of these massacres.
When these hearings were finished and these 3 huge volumes of a testimony were gathered, typed up, as I recall, they were just typed up. They were hidden away.
Yes.
Tell us why and who recovered them.
So these volumes are basically placed and hidden away in basically the county records, or the county state records office for a long time. And so looking about 1975, you have a Chicano historian who was working on the history of Mexican Americans in Texas, primarily looking at the civil rights and other things that were occurring. And he wanted to really look into this time period, which most people did not know about and only now barely know about.
His name was John Sandoz.
James Sandoz.
James Sandoz.
Yes. So James Sandoz was doing research and he came across this mention of this hearings that took place, but he couldn't find the actual, like what actually occurred or anything, a lot of coverage on it. So he went to the state archives and asking for it. And what ends up happening actually is that the clerk at the time didn't realize that she wasn't supposed to give him access to those records, but he got access to the records. And this is the first time that this transcript of this hearings came out. And so
are they pretty vivid?
Yes. So you have a lot of these stories were pretty much about lynchings and murders and things of that nature. And and so during this time it was.
What kind of people did the Texas Rangers lynch or execute?
The bulk of them were Mexican Americans.
And men? Were they mostly?
Mostly men, yes.
And boys?
Yes, mostly men and boys. Not exclusively though. There were obviously cases of rape and things of this nature, which sexualized violence was always a tool of terrorism.
Yes.
And so some of these stories, I heard when I was young from my grandfather. And so when you start reading them in these documents, it does 2 things. Once, it's horrifying, but it's also vindication for what these people's stories were true, that they're not embellishing what actually happened.
I remember growing up and reading and learning that this violence happened along the border because these Mexican American, Mexican men, Tejano men were, quote, bandits.
Yes.
what did you find that to be pretty common, the
Yes.
story for the violence?
So the bandits label has been around for a long time. It's morphed throughout the years. But it still holds. I mean, even up until this is a term to use to dehumanize people, to say that they're bandits. But were there some bandits that were actually there during this time? Probably. But the majority of people killed were workers or ranch workers, or were just people walking down the street.
And the goal was land acquisition.
Correct. So the goal was to and basically acquire the lands that were owned, to establish this system, which led to the creation of the canal systems, which were used to create the fields, right? The agricultural fields. This was the ultimate goal, and this is what happened, right? But yeah, I mean, we have these stories, and then of course, in '75, when James Sandoz comes across these documents, he actually uses it for his research. And
imagine that moment when he realizes, oh, here they are finally.
Yes, and the testimonies are pretty vivid, and over 200 people testified at these hearings, and so you have actual, government records that are showing.
Why do you think they were hidden away? I mean, the obvious one is it's an embarrassing, horrific episode to hide. But
so one of the things he found when he was looking through it was a little note in there that says, "Do not replicate," or "Do not," and so it's not available for public use. And so there's several theories on this, but the primary thing is, if these documents were made to come to light, they would be at the basically mercy of federal investigation for state-sanctioned violence. And
what they don't want is the feds involved.
Correct. And so to hide that away, because and especially when you're dealing with 1920s coming around and all these different things, we have the FBI starting to be formed and all these different things. And so this kind of coincides with a lot of what was happening at the time. Just recently, there's the movie coming out, Killers of the Flower Moon, which talks about the Osage murders.
The same basic story.
Same basic story, same basic times we're looking at. So what's interesting about that is that the Osage murders was the first major case of the FBI. So they were actually going after these things. And so at the time when the hearings were taking place, that was a real fear that they were going to be investigated. And the Texas Rangers and all these things would come out, and you're looking at it's opening a can of worms for the state of Texas.
And we'll recall that James T. Canales, then the state representative from that area, had received many, many death threats.
That is correct, yes.
And his work should be remembered for this major, major landmark of research and investigation.
Correct. So when JT first, one of the major things was trying to get this hearings done, and then during his time as a legislature, that was one of his biggest accomplishments. And when you read through there, it's really evident how much his own loyalty was questioned. But there was also several death threats, one by a particular Texas Ranger named Frank Hamer, who gained fame for being the guy who killed Bonnie and Clyde years later. But at the time, he was threatened by Frank Hamer, and so an interesting side story is Samuel Johnson, who was Lyndon B. Johnson's father, was actually has helped escort JT up and down the Capitol steps every day to protect him.
Oh, that's an enduring story.
Yeah.
And now that you mentioned a specific Texas Ranger, what I grew up learning about the Texas Rangers, mostly through the Lone Ranger, was how noble they were, how patriotic, how courageous. And this myth and this image that was torn apart during the hearings and led to the disbanding of one Texas Ranger unit and the reduction in force of another, that had to be pretty big in Texas at the time.
It was, the hearings led to was really a dismantling of the Texas Rangers as they existed at the time. Because at the time, the Texas Rangers were not a state police force. They were actually worked on as a special branch of the governor's office. And so...
that's always trouble.
Yes. So basically, I mean, in essence, they were the bodyguards of the governor, right? They were his own personal force in a lot of ways. So because of that particular fact is one of the reasons that led to the kind of dismantling of it was at the time. And of course, they got reconstituted in 1935 under the Department of Public Safety. But for a long time, Texas Rangers were not what people think they were. First of all, it was kind of an honorary position. People who got elected to the legislature would get their cousin a job as a ranger and things of this nature. And one of the other things, but a lot of these...
Thus, they weren't trained as law enforcement.
They were not trained as law enforcement. They didn't have they weren't bonded law enforcement agency, which basically means that they were not susceptible to the local laws.
And they weren't scrutinized.
No, I mean, it was very difficult because they operated out of the governor's office. So the governor was the last word on these things. But these Texas Rangers were for a long time mostly like hired guns. The bulk of the Texas Rangers from the beginning were always what we call ex-Confederates or ex-Southerners. There's Southerners who were coming in. And so they're coming in from the South, right, during the Reconstruction and this time period. So a lot of the techniques that they learned about lynching and other terroristic tactics, they learned from, the terroristic tactics they used in the South.
And from slavery.
From slavery, yeah, slave catching and things of that nature.
And we're still dealing with the repercussions of that. Just recently, a year or two ago, San Antonio College removed its mascot, which was the Ranger.
Correct. So that was a concerted effort by a group of students there that came out because of the research that the Refusing to Forget Project brought up. And, so because of the work that we've done, because of the exhibit that took place, led more people to understand why the Texas Ranger, what it actually meant to a lot of people in the community, Mexican Americans, who grew up with these stories. And of course, you look at popular culture and they're seen as heroes, but the fact of the matter was that they were not there's always going to be some, like they call there's some good ones that were there. True, but the majority of their mission was not to protect the people. Mm-hmm. It was to protect the interests of the governor's office. And that led to the expansion of specific interests. And so we have to look at it from that point of view. And most of the communities that they quote unquote policed were terrorized by the Texas Rangers.
Yes. The exhibit now on view at Our Lady of the Lake University is a version of Life and Death at the Border, which debuted in Austin at the Bullock. So tell us about that opening. It was just a week ago, but tell us about that opening, what the exhibit contains.
So it's a traveling exhibit which includes most of the story panels, like all of the story panels from the Bullock Museum. But it also, what we do, the way it's different at Our Lady of the Lake is that we invited the community, on the west side and all over to come and tell their stories. So during the event that happened last Saturday, or 2 Saturdays ago, was the kind of opening exhibit where we had a panel of, strong Chicano activists like Rosie Castro and Rosa Rosales were there, and Terry Canales and others, Terry Castillo, talking about their experiences with violence in these different spaces and how it continues to today. But it was really allowing the community to kind of talk about their own histories and their own violences and their own. And so the community, we had over 100 people show up to this event. And we took down, their histories and oral histories and recorded them so that we can archive them. But we also asked for different, objects to be displayed, because at the Bullock, there were specific objects that were there.
And they were beautiful, by the way. I loved how there was a wedding gown from that period. Different objects. I mean, I think the focal point was those volumes, but so many different objects from people who lived during that period. And there's an object that you contributed that you have talked about to me in a column I wrote. So tell us about that piggy bank.
So this was my great-grandmother's piggy bank.
Describe it. So
it's a small little white multicolored polka dot piggy bank. Looks like anything else, but it's from, I believe, 1890. And so she got that when she was a little girl, and it kind of passed on to me when I was young.
When was she born?
She was born in 1880. So we're looking at this object is well over 120 years old now.
And who lived during that period of terror.
That's correct. So she did, and and of course, her and my family lived during this period of time. And so this was just kind of her little piggy bank. That's kind of become I've had it ever since she passed, but that was 1989, right? And so this becomes a kind of what kids had during this time period. But this kind of an object is a symbol of what the families have and what they had. And so it has a whole history embedded with it. And it's just it's a basic little piggy bank, but it holds a lot of
memories for you.
Yes.
And stories, I'm sure, that were passed down in your family. And all of us have heard such stories in our family, whether they're accounts of family members or people we knew that were passed down, which were never legitimized until projects and Americo Paredes and Refusing to Forget. Tell us where we can read more about Refusing to Forget.
So Refusing to Forget, we do have a website, refusingtoforget.org, and that is where we house a lot of the information on what we've done. We've established a series of 4 different historical markers around the state of Texas. We've had series of events. The traveling exhibit is one of the things. So after it left the Bullock, we were able to get a grant to tour this around, and because of COVID and things, we were not able to start touring until recently. And so now it is being toured. And so this is one of the major things to get this history out into the world. I mean, not just in Texas, but we're traveling nationally as well.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, not only for your work, but the work of Refusing to Forget. And this exhibit, which is in the library, the third floor or the third floor of the library at Our Lady of the Lake University on the city's west side. It will be up until...
It'll be up until March 31st.
You have plenty of time. Yes. If it's not a part of the next month or so, certainly the new year offers ample opportunity. And during that time, you'll also be continuing to collect oral histories from people.
That is correct. We still want to collect the community stories. And so that's open to just give us and shoot us an email or whatever, and we'll set it up.
Give them your email address.
So they can email me at Carmona, CCARMONA at OLLU.SA.edu.
Thank you so much for being with us. Have a happy holiday.
Thank you.